I feel like it makes sense to start this video with just a brief overview of the story as it occurs chronologically as opposed to the story as it's told narratively. By the way, this video is going to contain spoilers for all sorts of different things because I don't really value spoilers the way that other people do. I like knowing what a story is before I see it, so I know what to expect, and then as a way of building my first hypothesis and then testing my hypothesis by means of actually reading the story or actually watching it in this case. Humanity discovers the Zohar, this weird relic that gives them, I guess they eventually realize, has potential for powering engines. They later decide to build this gigantic interplanetary invasion system with Deus that they call Deus, and it's powered in a way by the Zohar. This thing has a lot of different powers. The problem is, once it gets turned on, this mysterious Zohar pulls from a higher dimension some type of creature that is now encased within it. And this creature happens to be so powerful that, in spite of being imprisoned, gives the Deus system unlimited energy. And with that, the Deus system is shown as being far too powerful, far too dangerous. And so the result is that the machine is, with much difficulty, dismantled. It's put on a cargo ship, I guess, to be studied and analyzed somewhere else with regards to what went wrong. And it's that transport ship we see at the beginning of the game. Sometime during transport, two things happen. One is that we have the first incarnation of our primary protagonist. In this game, there's reincarnation. And the first incarnation, called Abel, comes in contact with the Zohar. And by making a physical contact with the Zohar, this being captured within it is aware of this contact and decides to grant its power to Abel, the child, who at the time is looking for his mother. So it happens to be that, for a number of reasons, because he's looking for his mother, one of the devices attached to this whole machine was a thing called the catamony that is capable of producing biological material and basically, in response to, powered by the Zohar, creates a sort of replacement mother for Abel. I guess here's where we have the Freudian idea of men just want to marry their mother, which I don't think I married my mother. But anyway, this is what happens. As probably after this time is when the Deus system becomes self-aware. So it's a computer system that becomes aware of its own existence. And with this, we get the whole crazy events of the game. We get this creepy flash on the screen. You shall be as gods is the one message humanity receives from this now self-aware Deus system. The ship crash lands after the captain decides to do a self-destruct thing because this system is very dangerous and sort of guesses what happened. Then we have the Deus system takes over the body of this woman that was created. Let's call her Ellie. Now becomes Miang. Miang now goes upon the mission of rebuilding Deus. Deus is part biological parts and part technological parts. And so the plot of the game, that for some reason takes 10,000 years, is basically Miang overseeing the development of a human race that's going to now provide and be the biological matter needed for the rebuilding of Deus. Then we go to the events of the game. We have another incarnation of that character I talked about from the beginning, Abel. Now this time he's called Faye. And the story arc basically follows him as he comes to eventually find out that all the events of this planet have been supervised by this secret organization created by Miang as a way of just getting Deus to be rebuilt. For what end, we don't really know. But that is what we're going to explore in this video. This video is me talking about how all this stuff relates to other fiction, and how I think a lot of that other fiction can be used as a way to better understand what happens in this story, and as a way of criticizing it. I don't think this is a perfect story by any means. It's got a lot of high ideas, a lot of missed marks in my opinion, but alright, so Xenogears. I found out about this story a while back. I don't remember how. Oh, Smooth McGroove did a cover of The One Who Bears Fangs at God, which was an odd title, but a really interesting song. I found the actual version of the song and was like, this is really interesting. It's like cool and mystical. I got really interested in Xenogears for a while after that. I looked it up on Wikipedia. I found the themes, the ideas of Xenogears really resonated with me. I'm interested in psychology in the sense that I'm interested in the humanities. So that the promise of psychological exploration I found interesting. Also, futurism, modernism, I don't know. Putting humanity in some kind of goofy future context I always find interesting. There's a lot of aspects of humanity don't change with the times. I would say that's actually kind of a rule of humanity, but we'll go on to that later on. They had a lot of this story, as far as I could tell, had a lot of promise going into it. What I'd really like to talk about, though, is what I think the game could have been versus what I would have made it. I honestly feel like it was a really cool story, but I honestly think the big problem is that it could have used some rewriting. Full disclosure, I did not properly play the game yet, but I did watch all 17 hours of Xenogears the movie. Somebody was really nice to post on YouTube, Xenogears the movie. It's like a 10-hour video and then a 7-hour video for the other part. And that I found interesting. I don't have time to play properly, so I thought, okay, let's just watch the story of the game. But before I go any further, I want to mention that I honestly think the big benefit of fiction is that more so than having something to say itself, rather, I think a lot of exploring fiction brings out our own thoughts. And that to the extent that stories usually write themselves, as a person who's written stories could usually tell you that stories do often write themselves. And I have to say that one of the reasons I like fiction as opposed to straight up philosophy, although I'm quite a bit of a philosopher in my opinion, that because stories write themselves, I think to a certain point the author suspends control of their creation, whereas the philosopher exerts it. The crew who put this story together was kind of a new crew, as far as I could tell. They hadn't really had much experience working with games before, and those problems come out, but we'll deal with that later on. But what I found most interesting, and I think the most effective way to kind of talk about the story, is to talk about its parallels with other works of fiction. I think that what the game could have been versus what it was is best understood by how similar ideas were dealt with in other stories. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with this. First off, before I actually watched the 17-hour Xenogears the movie thing, I did a whole lot of reading and rereading of the Wikipedia page to kind of get a sense of what the story was going to be about. I also watched videos from Resonant. He's a YouTuber who did a whole 3-part discussion series before he wrote his review, which I thought was really cool, and I really liked his content. I liked the way he talked about it. I also saw some stuff from a guy named Luxin. He has a bunch of videos about the whole Xeno series, the first of which being Xenogears. And I watched some other YouTube videos kind of trying to summarize the story. And I have to say that what everybody talks about is basically what happens in like the last 2 hours of the 17-hour story. I know there's a whole bunch of the rest of the game, so maybe it's hidden in there somewhere, and maybe people can tell me how I'm wrong, and maybe I'm wrong. But the thing is, a lot of the interesting ideas were stuff kind of related to sort of the ending of the game, if that makes sense. Mysteries kind of set in place that aren't really resolved until later. And honestly, that was kind of my issue. Is it didn't build the way I wanted it to. The story I ended up watching, like, it just wasn't the story I was expecting. It's like, okay, we're hanging out with this crew, Bart and the ship and other stuff, and how come nobody's calling out Satan for being weird and shady? But nonetheless, I feel like as a story crafted by philosophy, that the philosophical ideas come down in the form of characters, in the form of a narrative. It was a good first attempt as far as writing the draft is concerned. I didn't think it was particularly bad. I wasn't so disappointed. I mean, you expect games to kind of mess around with the big themes sort of being background. It makes sense as a way to put it together. One thing I really liked was the whole, this as far as I could tell, the various themes in the game. We have the whole concept of worshiping relationships. What does that mean? I don't know. I mean, I've heard pop songs like Somebody I Used to Know by Gautier or Gotcha, whatever his name is. The way that people view relationships is like, I don't know. I feel like people think it's the whole world. I mean, so the idea that a relationship is like your entire existence, that is something that seems like they explore in this game to an extent. That seems to be like that disposition, the attitude of the writers. We know the writers were a husband and wife team. I don't know if they were married during the project or whatever. The point is they had their relationship intact, and I thought it was interesting how they dealt with the relationship, but thematically, I was kind of okay with how they did it because, again, going to parallels with other works, other ideas. I'm a Muslim, and one of the things I've heard from Sufism, the people who study it, is that relationship between specifically a man and a woman, that's our religion. That's what I believe too. But this is the nearest parallel that exists with the relationship you're supposed to have with your creator. So it's talked about a lot in Sufi literature, where they talk about specifically a character from their canon in Arabia of a character called Layla, who's supposed to be the most amazing woman in the mind of the man who's always talking about her. Not so much necessarily the visuals. There's a whole bunch of people talk about Layla, and the whole idea being that, like, people are trying to understand his relationship or his fascination, that it's baffling to them. The idea is that that's the relationship we're supposed to have with our creator, is that people look at you and there's something a little off. So these people who wrote this story seem to really be into relationships. And they seem to also like the whole concept of, I think, a higher purpose. How the religious themes of the game, different characters are animated by different ideals. And it's interesting to see how they move around. I feel like that's kind of one of their themes, especially with regards to the Gazel ministry, sort of the artificial religion created by, I guess, Deus, or Deus through Miang, or however you consider the chain of events. The idea being that giving people a higher purpose is a way of controlling them. And I find that kind of interesting. So I wanted to explore that because as a person who, in my own life, I feel myself animated by the higher purpose of Islam. So I always wanted to see how this game would maybe challenge those ideas. Because I like being challenged myself. Challenging materials I feel more fun to look into. And the other theme was reincarnation, which they didn't really explore it too much. It's just kind of like a thing in the background too much. But I always found the idea of reincarnation somewhat interesting. To me, reincarnation is just kind of like a theological justification for learning from the past. Sort of suggesting that no matter how things change over time, you recur through history. Sort of like, and because I know people will sometimes say about religion, and I know this game deals with religion, that, religion was useful in the past, but like it's not useful now or something. Like humanity has evolved in some way. And that's another theme, evolution. So I kind of like the idea how you're going to explore those topics, but I also find it interesting how, if you really think about what reincarnation suggests, if you believe in it, it's something that I think is a rebuttal to modernism. The idea that humanity's existence changes in ways so important that you can't draw lessons from the past. To me, like I said, I think it's more like you can find yourself in the past. The idea that you literally find yourself in the past versus metaphorically, that's where you get a theological attitude about reincarnation. But that's kind of the way I've always understood it. Although I don't believe in reincarnation, I do say it's an interesting idea, and I don't completely discredit it and say like, oh, it's like wrong or stupid or whatever. I don't think that's really the correct way to look at it. Although I will say, I think reincarnation, I don't know, I haven't heard anybody else who said this. It seems like to be a way of justifying the caste system. I don't know if people know too much about India, but India is kind of a weird country internally as far as the dynamics they have between different castes. It's I don't know, seems to be something where it's like, oh, obviously I'm a rich man in this life because I was good in the last one, and obviously you're poor in this life because it seems like I don't know that this argument is made or not, but it seems like that's something you could, the life you have is the result of the previous life you had, and you better be good, or you're gonna come back as a snail or something. But that, again, goes into the whole idea of religion as a way to control people. I mean, no religion is immune to this idea. Whether it's good or bad, I don't know. Judge for yourself. But I want to get into the characters of this story because I thought Faye was kind of interesting. I was disappointed by Faye, but Faye as a broken person, I found this to be something kind of promising. I mean, I've not had the most rosy of lives. I haven't made the best of choices. So, naturally I'm going to identify with somebody who's, got a little work to do. With that, I thought Faye was kind of interesting, but I don't know. It's just the problem was he didn't really develop. It seemed like most of the story, he's just kind of weird and passively accepts what's happening. I understand the explanation later on in the game is that he's a new split personality, and that's why he's odd and malformed. People still have a sense that there's something more to him than the personality we see. So I guess, the justification makes sense, but it just didn't seem like he was really growing so much. I mean, the theme that Resonant Arc talked about was the theme of becoming whole. And by the way, it's a good video. You should watch it. I listened to that a whole bunch of times, actually, to be honest. But we never really see him become whole other than he has this relationship with Ellie. I don't really see him having much of an arc. In the end, he just kind of sort of comes to terms with a few things, and then he's awakened, and then the story happens. I mean, the problem is with the rushed production, they saved all the kind of juicy stuff for the end, and it ended up being rushed, so that was kind of a problem. I mean, Ellie, I identify with having a relationship with somebody who's got some problems, somebody who's a bit inhibited. That makes sense to me. But my whole problem is their relationship was it just seemed to be based on mutual pain, but I didn't really see much else. It was like they both hurt, and they both kind of hate life, and they're not on the same team. and then they are on the same team, and then existence still sucks, and then they have sex, and then like what? Like where's the part where they're like working like a team and like bonding other than just through suffering? And I don't know. And I wonder if this is just an outpouring of the relationship the writers had about relationship, and like if that's them we're watching, sort of. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. The relationship just felt like a miserable pop song, like Gautier. Like I was talking about Gautier. Like they don't really get like. I almost want to have like a fan fiction about how they don't end up working out in the future. Something. I don't know. There just didn't seem to be much there in the relationship, other than they have in common that their life is not good, which is it seems like a weak foundation. I feel like if that was the case, the relationships would be far more stable across the board. If just, oh, your life sucks, my life sucks. Oh, let's just. And I had a problem with Satan, though, because Satan was this guy that, like, it's like nobody questions him. We're really far into the game by the time that Satan is called out by Ellie. Like, how do you know all these things, and what are you doing? And then we don't even really see much. But I just thought he was kind of odd. He seemed to function. He seemed to have a function in the story, but he didn't really have much of a character. He was just really shady. He knew, like, a lot. And it seemed like everything in the story pretty much happens because he says so. Like, I don't know. I just found it to be kind of odd. Bart was cool, and I did like the relationship between Bart and Faye. I felt like there was a missed opportunity, though, between Bart and Faye, because Bart's kind of the rightful but reluctant king. He reminds me of Aragorn in that sense, in terms of the role he plays in his story. But the thing is, there's an interesting similarity between Faye and Bart, which is that both of them kind of don't want to receive what the world has told them is their destiny. And I would have liked to have seen more of that being explored. I would have liked to have seen more like Faye giving Bart advice, and it's really Faye talking to himself, and happens to be relevant to Bart or something like that. Or like Bart says something to Faye, and then it's really Bart talking to himself, and Faye takes something from it. Like moments like that. Their buddy relationship was fun to watch, though. I did enjoy that part of it, which is good because a lot of the story ends up involving Bart, and he seems to have more of an arc than anybody else. With regards to the whole Id, Graf, Lacan, and Wise Man thing, I kind of group those guys all together. Like, to the extent that Faye is growing and developing, it's like he's just kind of being messed with by these guys. One of the promises I had going into this was the idea that different schools of psychoanalysis would be explored in some way, but it seems like they were just kind of referenced. Like, we got Id is the other, like, weird, wacky personality of Faye. And then Graf is, like, Lacan's Id or whatever. But other than references, it didn't seem like there was much really there in terms of exploring psychology. I get that they were probably just cribbed a couple of basic ideas and said that, oh, yeah, he's split, and when he's split, he's like this, and so... But the problem is, all these different events basically tease at a whole bunch of growth that Faye is going to experience, but I just felt like we never really see him experience that kind of growth that, everybody kind of alludes to him having to make. He doesn't really stand up in the way that, you would like to see somebody who's the hero stand up. Then we have the idea of the ministry. And I guess the ministry is supposed to be some kind of representative of religion. I mean, as far as I can tell, the only religion it possibly parallels is the Catholic Church, and that's just because they're basically a corporation run by elites, which, oh, right, every corporation is run by elites because that's kind of the definition. They seem kind of generic. I get that they're these people that have a whole bunch of secrets. They honestly felt more like Freemasons to me. Like they just got a whole bunch of stuff that the higher ups know, and the other people don't. They're just kind of being manipulated. It's like I don't really see that as being parallel to any religious organization that I know of. I mean, cults, maybe. Religions and cults, if it's the same thing. I don't know. That's a topic for another video. But it seems to me that they were just kind of thrown in the background. We got the floating heads just kind of judging everybody. I get it. That makes sense to me. Okay, there we got this cult that's running things. But then we got the character Billy, who to me was just a missed opportunity. It was so fast after meeting Billy, acting out based on the convictions he has about, you know, the ministry's mission or whatever. And not long after meeting him, we just all of a sudden we get this long conversation about how, oh, don't you realize it's all just a lie or whatever? And I was just like, it just seemed like we didn't really get to feel the pain of getting to know him, understanding his convictions and where they come from, and how that resonates with and is inspired by the ministry. We didn't get to see that part of him really be explored, so that when it gets crushed, it's more impactful. It just seemed like kind of an afterthought. But that's why I say I think this thing really needed some more rewrites. I mean, you could easily do... I mean, this is more similar to the Freemasons, because the Freemasons have, obviously, the Shriners, who are out running their children's hospitals, doing the things that they do. And they're kind of low-ranking in the world of the Freemasons, so I understand. I don't know anything about them. I don't really care. It's just I never wanted to join them, so so I never looked into it. But that, honestly, as far as the setting up an allegory is concerned, it seems much more like a secret society than an actual religion. It's got, you know, its own little teachings, its own methods, but then there's this goofy separate hierarchy where secrets are being kept. Doesn't really feel like a religious organization per se. It seems like usually the people at the top kind of believe what they're doing. Maybe, unless they're all conspiracies. I don't know, maybe they're conspiracies or something. But now we start getting into the stuff that the people who talk about this game are more likely to talk about. I mean, I kind of talked about all the stuff I didn't hear a lot of the reviewers necessarily mention. I mean, Resonant Arc mentioned the whole Fae being kind of odd and derpy. But I didn't hear too much about a lot of the other plot elements and the other characters. One of the things that I found interesting was the whole Nissan sect. That there's a kind of separate religion in the world that I guess the world's like Ethos. I don't remember the name of the planet that they're on. But the Nissan sect seems to be something like... I think it's kind of implied to be sort of the true religion of the land, if that makes any sense. That the Zohar modifier, whatever the creature inside of the Zohar was, basically by producing Ellie and reincarnating Ellie over time, embedded or encoded within the constructed reincarnated Ellie these set of values that ended up becoming the religion of Nissan. And I find that interesting that you have this, because now this is what people do talk about. They talk about how the wave existence is this thing in the background that's kind of like captive, but still can cause reincarnation or something. Point is that we have this Nissan religion, which is different than the other religion, and they seem to have a central beliefs based around the significance of relationships. This was, again, like I said, something that reminded me of Sufism in the Islamic tradition, where a lot of importance is given to the emotions felt in the context of a relationship, where it's like, and I really did like that symbol of the one-winged angels, how they're both man with one wing, woman with one wing, together they can fly. That makes a lot of sense to me. That from the ethical system of Islam too. That's something very emphasized in the Islamic tradition. So with that, I found that's like, okay, I would like to explore the idea of relationships some more. That seemed like an interesting thing, the Nissan sect, and it sort of it was there. It existed. There was a different town that had a different vibe to it. It seemed to be more together. a town based not on the Solarian Gazelle ministry religion, but rather on the ideas, I guess, embedded within the existence of Ellie that kept coming through time. But now we get into the whole sci-fi aspects of the story, and this is what just about everybody talks about. And it is cool stuff. It's an interesting idea to play around with, but it wasn't explored that much in the game, as far as I could tell. The wave existence is, by definition, not the true god of the universe, and, well, it's captured. How is a god captured? Well, some higher order being, I think, is the way I understood it. This is where we start getting into other aspects of fiction, because I do think these ideas were really cool. The whole wave existence, artificial intelligence of Deus, these were the things that people like to talk about as far as the events prior to the game that play a role within the story. But that's the thing. It's like they play a role within the story, and the story is not about those things. But that's what the thing everybody talks about. But I want to get into this a little bit, because I do think the wave existence is a cool idea. I mean, never mind the plot hole if it has these goofy powers, but then it's still kind of imprisoned. Whatever. I feel like the idea that there's higher orders of existence. This is where we say, and we know one of the inspirations for the story was Arthur C. Clarke, and Childhood's End in particular. And for those who aren't aware of Childhood's End, my understanding of the basics of the story is that there comes to be a generation of children born on Earth who have telepathic abilities. And with these telepathic abilities, eventually arises a complete absence of lying, because you have the ability to read other people's thoughts and to hear what they are. And so people get this interesting level of honesty about them. But it's a quiet honesty where everybody just understands. And what emerges is through this is kids start having kind of like a lack of unique personalities. The characteristics of humanity of being unique individuals, different from one another, starts to disappear. But then this new hive mind starts to grow from the new collective of this generation of kids. And in the end, basically they kind of collectively ascend to a higher realm. Mankind has attained its destiny. And this idea, being kind of in the background of the universe, seems to be much more like Childhood's End than it is of whatever Gnosticism is. I think they were trying to pull from Gnosticism, but I think they accidentally just pulled from Arthur C. Clarke way more so than Gnosticism, because whatever they capture, whatever the Zohar modifier captures, seems to be something more like a higher entity. This reminds me of something more like the Q from Star Trek, where they have lots of powers, but they have some limits, and they kind of exist in this alternate dimension that has some access to our own. So it makes sense that the Zohar caught something like that. Not so much like whatever a demiurge is supposed to be. I mean, I get the idea, but it seems to be something more like from Star Trek or Arthur C. Clarke than anything else. And especially Arthur C. Clarke, because we got the monolith from 2001. If people aren't familiar with 2001, the movie basically starts with a whole bunch of apes. And the apes are looking at this big black rectangle thing sticking out of the desert. And what is this thing? It's so clearly unfamiliar that the apes are just like freaking out. And the effect on the mind of the apes is such that one of the apes starts getting a little creative. I guess triggered by the challenge of what is this clearly otherworldly thing that has come into their existence. And so there's kind of the theme of evolution in 2001. To me, when we first find the monolith in Xenogears, I was like, well, I just called it the monolith. When we find the Zohar modifier, or the Zohar relic, or whatever you call it, I mean, they put a goofy design on it, but it's like, that's the monolith. It's got the rectangle shape and everything. It's mysterious. Basically the prior backstory of Xenogears, humanity finds it. experiments with it, it ends up being the thing that they determined, like, oh, this there's a lot of ability, there's a lot of potential in this Zohar relic to now be a power source. So that was interesting. But to me, it just seemed like the monolith from 2001, which was, again, Arthur C. Clarke. Interesting movie, by the way, if you ever watch it. Then we get into now the whole Deus. And I found Deus to be a really fresh, interesting idea of artificial intelligence. I mean, everybody knows Terminator. What happens when the machines become self-aware? They immediately identify humans as the biggest threat and try to wipe out all humans. And I'm like, so I like that when we see that with Deus, we don't really see that with Deus. I mean, the opening scene is cryptic and goofy, but I felt they had a really interesting take on artificial intelligence. But this is where I get into what I said earlier, which was that the story as it was written versus what I would have done in rewriting. Because my problem is Deus is interesting, but we don't really get to see much of what Deus is really thinking. I mean, Deus is thinking. It's a computer that's self-aware. The most we ever have is Miang, who's mostly just there to execute his objectives. But what is Deus' intentions? What is Deus really thinking? That's just completely shrouded. The only glimpse we get as to what Deus is thinking is that red text on the screen at the beginning, "You shall be as gods." Now, my explanation of that, and this is my imagination filling the gaps. I saw that and I thought, Deus was connected to the Zohar, which captured this higher level entity, and we know from the end of the story that Deus, rebuilt, has an ability to transmigrate or whatever, go to this higher world. Deus has the ability, probably by means of the Zohar, to go to this higher world. So I think what happened was that once Deus became self-aware, a number of discoveries happened. One is that this self-aware machine is able to detect that something other than itself is contained within this Zohar. So I suspect that Deus immediately became aware of its ability to transport people and itself to a higher plane of existence. And I think Deus, knowing that humanity was its creators, made a sincere invitation to humanity in the form of, "You shall be as gods." I think that was Deus not understanding how human beings think. and going back to childhood ends, the adults who see these new telepathic children are really kind of freaked out by him. For lack of a better term, dumb people are sometimes freaked out by really smart people. So Deus, being awkward, it's freshly conscious, then decides to now invite humanity to this great thing that, hey, you guys want to be gods? I'll take you to the Q continuum, like we talked about from Star Trek. And so that invitation is really interesting. But then we get into the character of Krelian. And my problem with Krelian is somebody who's supposed to find that invitation from Deus appealing. He's working towards the end of resurrecting Deus for the purpose of going to this higher plane of existence. But what is Krelian trying to escape? I mean, because generally the way a person wants to go to something like this is something painful or difficult about this world makes them want to leave it. Usually that's what motivates a character like that. We got, like, from Star Trek Generations, which really worth watching. We got this character who is in this cool alternate dimension of fantasy utopia. He ends up leaving it somehow, and his whole objective is trying to get back to it. And for this, he's willing to do whatever. It reminds me of Kingpin from the movie Into the Spider-Verse, where in Into the Spider-Verse, it's like the main villain is just, in the current reality, his wife and child are dead. And so he's trying to find a way to go into or bring an alternate reality into being where they're not dead. And so his whole motivation is now understandable. It's single-minded. It's strong. And this is, again, there's a tragedy there. In the case of Sauron from that Star Trek movie, it's like, well, he's no longer in utopia. He's back to crappy real world or whatever. Or in the case of Kingpin, he doesn't have his family anymore. But what motivates Krellian? I have no idea what motivates Krellian. He's just kind of single-mindedly going for it in a way that, like, seems crass. It doesn't seem like it's motivated by something understandable. I think of, like, a good villain. Imagine, because you'll see, like, redemption arcs of villains, like, currently rewatching Avatar: The Last Airbender. Zuko's a great redemption arc because the whole movie, the whole series, you're kind of feeling his pain, and it's like you want him to just get it. You want him to take the advice of his uncle. You want him to, to turn around and do it right. Eventually he does, right? But the problem is when it comes to Krellian, he single-mindedly goes after his thing, but it's like, again, we don't have the tragic backstory. It doesn't really feel like he's getting redemption. The problem was, and one of the things that made me excited about the game was that I watched the ending cutscene, and I wanted to know what led up to this ending cutscene, because Krellian's like, I've done so many sins. The only one who could forgive me was God. And I was like, this seems like an interesting story for which this is the ending. But then I just get this, like, Darth Vader type character, like he's just kind of a jackass and is important within this society, not entirely the most powerful person. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, he's got this tragic side to him, and I didn't buy it. Krellian was kind of weak. I mean, if he's going to be redeeming, what's he redeeming himself from? And like, what did something trigger his change of heart? That he's on the bad path and wants to turn it around? Well, what triggered? There's a whole bunch of questions unanswered with him. But I want to state that I really like the ideas of the story, more so than what the story really ended up being. It was fascinating. It was cool. But that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit. Now, exploring the theme of becoming whole, there's a number of different things going on with regards to wholeness, because we have with Faye has the split personality. The different parts of his mind, the different parts of his existence are not in harmony with one another. And so we have with Faye the problem of becoming whole as a person, acknowledging certain aspects of your emotions, certain aspects of your past. And so that is one theme of becoming whole in the form of Faye. And I found that really interesting because it does make a lot of sense. One of my own theories on personal growth is that, the idea that your weak points, not that your weak points become your strength, but rather if you can learn to work around them or with them such that they no longer impede you, that's a way that you're going to be more effective as a person. And so, yeah, that made a lot of sense, the idea that Faye is going to do it. I don't think he really did it in the storyline, but that's supposed to be kind of what's happening, that the three different parts of Faye come back together to become one unified Faye. So that is one part of becoming whole. That's becoming whole with yourself. And then we have the dynamic relationship between man and woman explored with Faye and Ellie, where another part of them becoming whole is that as humanity is the offspring of a man and a woman, then the idea that by being together, there's a different kind of wholeness, the wholeness of being with the other. It's not so much that you are whole individual, although definitely if you are developed as grown, then somebody else grown and developed, then together, it's the whole one-winged angel. They both come together, now they have two wings. So the idea that you don't just become whole as an individual, but you also become whole as a team, and then the larger dynamics of family, or in this case, mostly camaraderie, of working together. And that's, again, seems to be kind of the religious attitude of Faye towards the end, where they're talking about how, oh, life is hopeless, yada, yada, yada. And he's like, no, I think humanity can understand one another. And in that moment, you can tell he's kind of drawing from his experience with how Faye has helped him grow. I still think the growth was kind of weak, but nonetheless, that was supposed to be what the story was. That this is another way of Faye becoming whole. Then we got a couple other forms of becoming whole. The main two I want to talk about is the whole natural evolution versus technological evolution. Because they have another Star Trek parallel here with regards to Nikolai Balthazar. By the way, the reason it's, for me, very worthwhile to explore a 17-hour story is to find those little side stories that say something about the larger story. And to me, that moment with Nikolai Balthazar and the whole Ziebzane and Achzane, which is just German for 17 and 18. But those, I found that to be really interesting as an aside. And I'll tell you why. It reminds me of the Borg from Star Trek. So let me tell you about the Borg. So going back to childhood's end, we have humanity just naturally one day hits a point of evolution where they become this crazy mental collective that ascends to a higher level. In Star Trek, we have the Q, who are basically the same thing. In this world of Star Trek, we have the Q were a species like humans that experienced the kind of evolution we saw in Childhood End. And then that's why the higher order being comes to visit humanity, because in a way they are the future of humanity and they want to guide the progress of humanity. Then we have the Borg. And the Borg are like Nikolai Balthazar, because what did the Borg do in the Star Trek universe? They modified and enhanced their own beings with technological parts. If you ever see the Borg in Star Trek, they're the characters that are basically like pale zombies that have a whole bunch of mechanical parts around, and they got these goofy robot arms with different devices on them. And they're just kind of freakish zombie creatures. They're all technologically hooked into a collective, as opposed to telepathically. But we have a really interesting parallel between these two, because with regards to the Q and the Borg, we have natural evolution versus technological evolution. Now, how does this relate to becoming whole? Well, the idea that there's some destiny for you in the future, what that destiny is, we don't necessarily know, but the idea that we're moving towards it, in a sense that just as how an individual of Faye grows, or in the Star Trek world, the captain of the Enterprise, Picard, grows. And in the sense that a person is reaching a level of actualization, it's not necessarily a becoming whole per se, but it is about becoming better. And the idea that it happens naturally over time versus you force it to happen. You give yourself strength. And what's interesting is how, and this, again, this resonates with me. Islamically, we have this idea that generally, to the extent that a hierarchy of greatness exists within the world, that something is always greater than what it creates. That's why generally you have an etiquette that you respect your parents, because they are, in a sense, your creators. Worldly sense. We don't believe in absolute terms they're not your creators. But the idea being that they have something over you in that regard. And so respect is what's required in that scenario. But here we have this Nikolai guy, and I'm pretty sure that's a reference to Tesla. I believe his name was like Nikola Tesla. They like using names as references in this game. But he creates this big robot creature, and I love that it's a humanoid. We'll get into that. But he creates this humanoid creature that he's going to be able to now merge with. similar to the Borg. And so the idea that he's going to enhance himself technologically, but it's technological, therefore unnatural. And the result is that to the extent that the computer intelligence interacts with his intelligence, it wrecks his mind and destroys him. He's no longer what he once was. And the same thing happens in the Star Trek universe. The Borg assimilate Picard. That is, they put all the devices on him and hook him in, and now he's one of them. His humanity, rather than being something shed through telepathy like the childhood end people, you then have the idea that your humanity is just stripped away from you technologically. And that is what we see with him. Eventually he decides, he's not himself anymore, and that ends up being kind of a tragic aside. But I found that so interesting, that he tried to merge with his creation, and in so doing corrupted his being. That was a really cool little aside to me, and I felt like it was worth, the whole 17 hours was worth it just for that own little stretch. And that kind of goes into my major thesis overall, but we're going to go on to that later on. Then we have the other part of becoming whole, which is joining with a higher degree of reality. In the way that Billy is motivated by these higher principles. In a way, he's one with this higher order being by means of acting out its will. Miang does so in a programmed way. Billy does it in a willful way. And I find that interesting because that's kind of the way that Islamically we understand the difference between human beings who follow the religion versus angels. Angels do so out of command and don't possess the ability to choose in the way that humans do. So Miang is this, extremely dedicated angel-like figure with regards to, the metaphor of Deus is, something analogous to God. Versus Billy, who is one who has actual conviction. And through that conviction is kind of trying to be one and act out the principles of some higher being that he thinks is worthy of veneration and respect. So the whole idea of being one with your creator, that is what religion seems to be about as far as this world is concerned and as far as the world I live in is concerned. There we get into the whole Corellian wanting to become one with the way of existence. Again, we got the problem of Corellian's not that great of a character, but that seems to be something that they explored. I do find it interesting to think about those things. Miang, the automaton, versus Billy, the dedicated person. The one who wants to become a better person, in the way like Faye does. I mean, by integrating different parts of himself and making it work and using it all for good. There's a whole lot of stuff related to becoming whole. And I just found it really interesting to explore this. Before I move on to kind of my big overall thesis about this game, just to give credit to everything they did right. I mean, I did think the characters were somewhat convincing. The relationships were mostly good. I do think it was weird. I felt like Satan was mostly a plot device and not really much of a character. It didn't make sense that nobody else is really questioning him. So I didn't really like that. And it just seemed to me that this story suffered the same way the Star Wars prequels did, which is that I just feel like the authors didn't know how to write the story they wanted. And what I mean by that is that in the Star Wars prequels, we're going to now see what is alluded to by Obi-Wan Kenobi in what they decided, I guess, later on was Episode 4. I don't know if that was their intention the whole time, but the idea that he was this great noble Jedi, who was corrupted and seduced by the dark side. And so the promise of the prequels is that we were going to see that seduction. But I just think the people behind the project, and George Lucas maybe in particular, had no idea how to write that story. The only thing I know of in the world of fiction that's like it is Citizen Kane, where you have an idealistic young go-getter wants to have a really good newspaper, and just slowly over the course of film becomes like a weird dirtbag of a character. and it's like, so I had to, again, with the prequels, here's what we have in the way of promise. This is the story we think we're going to get. Instead, they just write him in as an a-hole from the beginning, and Anakin Skywalker's arc is just like, this isn't what you said it was going to be. I understand that would have been a really cool story to see, the gradual corruption of a great noble Jedi and a good friend. But they didn't know how to write this story. And I think the same problem exists with Xenogears. We wanted to write about how a person becomes whole with a person helping them along the way in terms of a relationship, or in the way of really confronting his weaknesses. And we didn't get that story. I don't know that they knew how to write that story. I mean, you can't really write a story you don't know, you don't research. And I just think that the problem was they took the ideas, put them into people, and then just kind of left it. And I think it was just a problem of maybe they didn't have the time or the budget to go through a rewrite process and be like, how well did the characters effectively represent the ideas? Because they could have. I saw the potential, but the potential just for me wasn't realized. But the one big takeaway that I really got from this, my great thesis as I've referred to it, it reminds me a lot of idolatry. In Islamic thought, as far as I can tell, we have a principle about the Creator, who we call Allah, that there is nothing similar to Allah. So the proof that what you think in your mind is not Allah is that you're even able to think it at all. The idea that Allah is above comprehension. And then we have the idea that idol worshiping is the dumbest thing a person can do. We have the idea that something you create, how is it going to be greater than you? Again, going back to earlier, the idea of, respecting the chain of creation, which is why I believe that Deus, recognizing humanity as its creators, wanted to do right by its creators. And that's where I saw Deus is kind of similar to Frankenstein's creature. I found that to be kind of interesting, that parallel between Deus and the plot line of Frankenstein. And I have to go into that real quick, because we're talking about how, because we have in the Western world, when Frankenstein was written, something of the idea of playing God, of trying to create life, which I don't know, creating life seems to be a rather old-fashioned activity. But the idea that you're going to create an intelligence unconventionally, let's call it that. Frankenstein's creature is creepy and weird and not really properly a regular human. And in the story of Frankenstein, the Victor Frankenstein, who's the doctor, after he sees his creature, is just kind of grossed out by it and just leaves, just straight up abandons the creature. So now the creature is abandoned by its creators, and upon being abandoned by its creator, now has an existential threat of like, I'm rejected by my creator. What is this? I think there was supposed to be a religious allegory within Frankenstein, maybe something relevant to how humanity was placed on this planet, but kind of left to our own devices or something like that, which the whole idea of prophets is that, no, you're not left to your own devices. God sends messengers. The idea that to be rejected by your creator, I mean, there's something deeply analogous to this. I mean, we go into Faye's psychology and Faye's backstory of what Faye believes to be his mother is abusing him. Well, we went earlier to the attitude you naturally have towards your parents is that as far as you're concerned, they're your creators in a worldly sense. And so when they mistreat you or they treat you badly, I mean, it's devastating. And that's kind of what we see with Frankenstein's creatures. Like, my father just abandons me. What am I supposed to do with this? And then the world doesn't like me. I mean, there's something deeply resonant about this story. And I think this is something similar to what Deus experiences. Because as soon as he becomes conscious, wants to do right by his creators, and so invites humanity to this higher plane of existence in the best way that he knows how, not knowing much about humanity at the time. and has to suffer the pain of humanity freaks out and tries to evacuate the ship, and just in a rage, a freshly conscious childlike rage, Deus destroys, basically what's left of humanity at that point. They're trying to escape, because that's what happens to Frankenstein's creature. After Frankenstein's creature is rejected by his creator, goes on a crazy revenge rampage against Frankenstein's whole family. The whole plot line is basically this creature is slowly and systematically killing everybody that ever mattered to Victor Frankenstein as a way of getting revenge on him for his creation. What did you create before? You're just going to leave me away. And so with regards to childhood trauma, they could have explored that theme a little bit better by exploring Deus. Then we have by this a parallel with Deus and Faye, because the traumatized Faye and the also rejected and emotionally damaged Deus. There's a great similarity between the two of them. The idea that the computer was just at most just this weird monster you fight once, and then has Miang as a mouthpiece, it just seemed like a missed opportunity. Now, going back to idolatry, the whole idea that people rely on these gears, these technologies, and that these are all human. In the end, it's not really the gears that save the day, it's the people. The gears are a means to an end. And the problem with idol worship is that they're literally just means and they produce no ends. Statues, that is. And the idea that if you really get into these statues in the way of Nikolai Balthazar, it corrupts your mind, it corrupts your being. The idea that there should be some kind of, say, disrespect that you have towards your creation, that you're okay with wrecking it and rebuilding it better the next time. And in that sense, it's metaphorical to your own existence, that rather than put so much stock into what you are, put more stock into what you could be and put your effort into that, as opposed to creating something and believing it to be so perfect that you try to merge with it or become one with it. And the interesting thing is that, I, as a person looking at this made-up story, find myself compelled to dive into it, is in itself something analogous to idolatry. There's something in here that's deep and important, and I have to find out what it is. It's the pursuit of greater understanding. I felt like this story was going to have a lot of interesting puzzles for me to solve and make sense of with regards to my own attitude towards existence. And those attitudes are what I've tried to express in this talk. Basically, as far as I could tell, it was an interesting challenge, and I did like the story. Mostly the last 2 hours, but it was interesting nonetheless. I have to say, I don't really know what the creators of this story were really going for, but as to the extent that their interests were represented in the story, they did a decent job of it. To me, it was just kind of a bit of a letdown. I feel like there really could have been a lot more to this than there ended up being. I just kind of wanted to talk about how my imagination tried to fill the gaps between the story as it was and the story as it could have been. I feel like I get why people find it so fascinating. I mean, 15 of those hours seem to be pretty unrelated to what everybody really focuses on. And that was kind of the biggest disappointment, because the ideas were really great. Hey guys, my camera got messed up, so I had to re-record this ending. Long story short, artificial intelligence creates its own cult-like secret society. Pretty trippy. Anyway, I didn't intend for this video to be anything too definitive. My intention is actually to make a follow-up video in response to your comments. I would really like to hear what you guys think about the game, about my analysis. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and hopefully I can see you all again soon. Bye-bye.